The chalk dust was a ghost on her fingers, a pale, erasable memory of a life she was about to leave behind. Frances Hadley stood in the empty schoolroom, the late afternoon sun striping the floorboards through the tall, mullioned windows. It was the sort of light that revealed every mote of dust dancing in the air, every scuff mark on the desks, every ending. For 3 years this room at the Bletchley Academy for Young Ladies had been her world, a small, orderly kingdom of grammar and sums, of neatly ruled lines and the faint, clean scent of ink and beeswax. Now her boxes were packed, her final wager, disappointingly thin envelope, tucked into her reticule. She had been dismissed. Not for any failing in her teaching, but for a failing of a more delicate and therefore more damning nature. She had run out of usefulness. A schoolmistress with opinions is a luxury the board can no longer afford, Miss Hadley, the headmistress had said, her voice thin as a winter wafer. The word sat in her mind like a cold stone. It meant not noticing when the Becraz bill was padded. It meant not insisting the younger girls be given books of substance instead of endless samplers. It meant not speaking the plain, unvarnished truth in a world that preferred its truths draped in lace and polite lies. Her final act of nonconformity had been to quietly defend a new maid accused of stealing a silver spoon that had in fact merely been misplaced by the headmistress's own flustered daughter. The maid had kept her position. Frances had lost hers. It seemed a fair, if painful, trade. A poor gentlewoman with opinions is a luxury no household can afford. She ran a hand over the smooth dark wood of her own desk, its surface scarred with the history of countless other teachers. Her private guilt, a constant, quiet companion, stirred in the silence. It was not this dismissal that haunted her, but an older one, a failure of her own making. Years ago at her first post, a bright, fragile student named Eliza had been entrusted to her care. A girl full of questions and of fierce secret poetry. Frances had seen herself in that fire and had tried to bank it, to make it safer, more conventional. She had taught Eliza conformity, and in doing so, had snuffed out the very thing that made her burn. Eliza had faded, marrying a man of her father's, choosing and disappearing into a life of quiet, respectable misery. Frances had promised to nurture minds, and she had, in one crucial instance, pruned one into submission. The guilt of it was a lesson she had never forgotten. She would never make that mistake again. She would speak the truth, even if it cost her everything. As it now had, the door creaked open. It was not the headmistress, but Lady Beatrice, the school's most prominent patroness, a woman whose smile was as bright and hard as the diamonds at her throat. She was the aunt of the local magnate, the Duke of Allister, a man so remote and powerful he was more of a local legend than a person. "Ah, my dear Miss Hadley," Lady Beatrice began, her voice a silken river of condescension. Heard the dreadful news. So unjust. She glided into the room, her silks rustling like dry leaves. But perhaps a blessing in disguise. Frances said nothing, merely inclining her head. She had learned that with women like Lady Beatrice, silence was the only ground one could not lose. There is an assembly at the hall tonight," Lady Beatrice continued, examining a globe as if considering a purchase. A charity affair for the new orphanage. The Duke, my nephew, will be there, of course. He is so burdened, poor boy, ever since his parents' that tragic passing, saddled with those 3 unruly siblings of his. He needs a distraction. And I, she said, turning her bright, predatory gaze on Frances, I need a companion. It would be a small act of charity on your part, to lend an old woman your arm. It was a command masquerading as a request. Frances understood its true nature. She was to be a prop, a plain, respectable foil to Lady Beatricia's glittering performance, a demonstration of her own charitable nature. Yet a part of her, the practical part that knew her savings would not last the season, saw the cold logic. To be seen with Lady Beatrice, even as a glorified servant, was to remain visible. To disappear into obscurity was a kind of death for a woman in her position. You are very kind, my lady," Frances said, her voice even. Excellent," Lady Beatrice chirped. Wear your best dress, dear. The gray one is serviceable." She paused at the door. "And do try to look a little less like you were attending a funeral. It is a party, after all." The crime was that she had been chosen first, not by the Duke, not yet, but by his aunt for a purpose Frances could not yet divine, but which she felt in her bones was not a kind one. The assembly hall was a cacophony of sound and light, a glittering sea of silks and jewels that made Frances feel like a small gray moth that had blundered into a bonfire. Her dress, her only good one, was indeed gray. It was clean, well-mended, and utterly invisible against the vibrant peacock blues and ruby reds of the Countess elite. Lady Beatrice had paraded her through the room, making a great show of introducing her as a "my dear, clever little schoolmistress," a label that managed to be both a compliment and an insult in the same breath. Now, thankfully, her patroness had been drawn into a vortex of gossiping dowagers, leaving Frances blessedly alone near a pillar. She watched the room, her teacher's eye sorting the players, the nervous debutantes, the preening young bucks, the matrons assessing horseflesh and marital prospects with the same discerning gaze. And then she saw them, the Duque's siblings. She knew them by reputation. Lady Eleanor, at 17, was a storm cloud in watered silk, her face a mask of furious boredom. Master Julian, perhaps 12, had the look of a trapped hawk, his eyes darting everywhere, missing nothing, his body coiled with a silent, simmering energy. And little Miss Cecily, no more than 8, was a ghost, clutching the hand of her governess so tightly her knuckles were white, her gaze fixed on the floor. They were orphans, dressed in the finest clothes, living in the grandest house, and utterly, devastatingly lost. Then she saw him, the Duke of Allister, Crispin. He was not what she expected. The legends painted him as a cold, arrogant tyrant, the man standing by the French doors, watching his siblings with an expression of such profound, weary responsibility, was something else entirely. He was tall, and built on straight, severe lines, his dark hair brushing the high collar of his immaculate black coat. He had been a boy, they said, when the carriage accident had claimed his parents, leaving him a duke and a father in the same horrific instant. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. Now, he was a man, frozen by duty, his face a handsome, unreadable mask. He noticed things. Frances could see it in the way his gaze tracked the nervous footman, the way his jaw tightened when a boorish lord laughed too loudly near his youngest sister. He was a guardian, a sentinel, a man standing watch over a house of sorrows. His gaze swept the room, and for a fractional second, met hers. There was no recognition, no interest. She was simply part of the architecture, a gray pillar holding up a corner of the room. He looked away, his attention snagged by his aunt who was now bearing down on him. Frances turned her attention back to the children. She saw Lady Eleanor's fan snap shut with a crack that spoke of sheer frustration. She saw Julian deliberately trip a passing servant, a small vicious act of rebellion. She saw little Cecily flinch as a burst of laughter erupted from a nearby group. They were drowning, and their brother, their guardian, was too locked in his own ice to reach them. A voice, slick with false sympathy, spoke at her elbow. Such a tragedy, is it not?" It was Mr. Villa Finch, a trustee of the school, a man whose flattery was as thick and cloying as cheap honey. The Duke is utterly at sea with them. They say the girl has not spoken a full sentence in a year. The grief takes many forms, Frances said quietly, her eyes still on Cecily. A grief, or stubbornness. Mr. Grief, Finch chuckled to his aunt, Lady Beatrice, believes a firmer hand is needed. She has petitioned the courts, you know, to have them made her wards. For their own good, of course. The pieces clicked into place. The invitation, the performance of charity. Lady Beatrice was not just a social climber, she was a predator, circling a wounded family. And Frances, the dismissed schoolmistress, was a pawn in her game. Suddenly, Lady Beatrice was there, her smile a terrifying slash of red in her powdered face. Mr. Finch and Miss Hadley, I was just telling my nephew how very intellectual you are, my dear. She took Francia's arm in a grip that was surprisingly strong. Crispin, darling, she called out, pulling Frances toward the Duke. You simply must meet Miss Hadley. She has such interesting ideas about education. The Duke turned. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, were cold as a winter sea. He looked from his aunt to Frances, his gaze taking in her simple dress, the flush on her cheeks, the chalk ghost she was certain still clung to her fingertips. Tss. Miss Hadley, he said. The words were a statement, not a question. His voice was low and quiet, with a rough edge, like stones being dragged over stones. Your Grace, she murmured, executing a small curtsy. My aunt is a great collector of interesting people, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no warmth in them, only a piercing, unnervous assessment. He was trying to solve the puzzle of her presence. And I am her latest acquisition, Frances replied, the words out of her mouth before she could stop them. A flicker of something surprise, amusement, crossed his face before the mask slammed back down. Lady Beatrice laughed, a brittle, glassy sound. Oh, she has a wit, this one. A dry little thing. Aye, she patted Frances' arm. Now I must have a word with the vicar. You two talk. Get to know one another. And with that she abandoned Frances, leaving her standing before the most powerful man in the county, like a lamb tethered to a stake. An awkward silence stretched between them. He did not seem to feel its weight. He was simply waiting. For what? She could not imagine. To fill the void, she found herself speaking, her voice steadier than she felt. Your siblings, she began, nodding toward the trio. They seem unhappy. A brilliant deduction. Miss Hadley, he said, his tone flat. You are as observant as my aunt claimed. The cut was clean, sharp, and meant to draw blood. Frances felt a flash of anger, not for herself, but for the children he was failing. Her own hard-won moral courage asserted itself. Observation is a tool, Your Grace. It is what one does with it that matters. She said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Your sister Eleanor is not bored. She is clever and desperate for a challenge that does not involve choosing lace. Your brother Julian is not vicious. He is drowning in a rage he cannot name and has no outlet for. And your sister Cicely is not stubborn. She is terrified. He went utterly still. The mask did not crack, but something behind it shifted. He was no longer looking at her as a puzzle, but as a threat, or perhaps, a source of an unwelcome truth. It was at that moment that Lady Beatrice chose to make her move. She had been watching, waiting. With a swift, almost imperceptible motion, she nudged a passing footman, laden with a tray of wine. The footman stumbled, twisting to regain his balance. A full glass of dark red wine arched through the air, a perfect, glittering trajectory of malice, and landed squarely on the bodice of Frances's gray dress. A collective gasp went through the room. The wine, dark as blood, bloomed across the pale fabric, soaking through to her chemise. The cold shock of it stole her breath. But the chill of the wine was nothing to the sudden freezing silence of the room. Every eye was on her. On the cheap, ruined dress, on the stain that marked her as surely as a brand. Lady Beatrice rushed forward, her face a mask of theatrical horror. Oh, my dear child, your dress. Your only one, the words laced with false pity, were a dagger. She was not just a poor relation now, she was a charity case, a clumsy object of pity. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over Frances. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, judging, dismissing. She stood frozen, the drips of wine sounding like hammer blows in the roaring silence of her ears. This was it. This was the engineered public fall. She was ruined, not by scandal, but by something far more insidious: pity. Then, a movement. The Duke, who had been a statue of cold fury, took a single step forward. He did not look at his aunt. He did not look at the gawking crowd. He looked at her. He noticed the way she did not cry out. He noticed the way her chin came up. A small, defiant gesture. He noticed the way her hands, instead of fluttering in distress, clenched into small, tight fists at her sides. He noticed that she was not broken, but bracing. And in that moment, something in Duke Crispin, something that had been frozen solid for years, cracked. He shrugged out of his evening coat. It was an act of shocking impropriety. A duke did not disrobe in public. The coat was heavy, made of the finest black wool, lined with silk. The crowd murmured, confused. He walked the 2 steps that separated them and, without a word, draped the coat over her shoulders. It was huge on her, enveloping her from shoulders to knees. It smelled of winter air, of clean linen, of him, but more than that, it was warm. A profound, impossible warmth that chased away the chill of the wine and the deeper chill of her shame. It was a shield. It was a claim. He had wrapped his world around her. The room erupted in whispers. Lady Beatricia's face was a thunderous mask of fury. This was not how the scene was supposed to end. Francis looked up at him, bewildered. The coat was a weight, a burden, a shocking, public kindness she did not understand. His gray eyes were no longer cold. They were blazing. Your grace," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. You cannot, your reputation, your position. You must find someone worthy of you." It was a plea, a desperate attempt to hand him back his sanity, to rewind the last 30 seconds. He looked down at her, the noise of the room seeming to fade into a dull roar. His gaze was intense, unwavering. For the first time she felt truly seen, not as a schoolmistress, not as a charity case, but as a person who had stood her ground. He leaned in, his voice so low it was for her alone, a quiet certainty in a world of whispers. Miss Hadley," Duke Crispin said, "I'd believe I already have." It was not a declaration of love, it was a statement of fact. And it was the most terrifying and exhilarating thing she had ever heard. He took her arm, his grip firm and steady over the heavy wool of his own coat, and led her from the center of the room. He did not hurry. He did not look at the stunned faces of the county. He simply walked, with her on his arm, as if they were the only 2 people in the world. The whispers followed them, like the rustle of snakes in dry grass. They were no longer just a duke and a schoolmistress. They were a scandal. And in the cold, calculating eyes of Lady Beatrice, they were a war. The walk from the assembly hall to the Duca's waiting carriage was the longest of Francisa's life. Every step felt both a flight and a procession. She was acutely aware of the weight of his coat, a dark, heavy mantle of consequence. She was aware of his hand on her arm, a steady, warm pressure that was both a comfort and a cage. The world had narrowed to this single shocking point of contact. He handed her into the carriage with a formal grace that seemed absurd under the circumstances. The door closed, shutting out the gawking faces and the chill night air. Inside, the carriage was dark, smelling of leather and polish. It was a small, contained world, a bubble of silence. After the storm of the ballroom, he sat opposite her, a formidable silhouette against the gas lamps passing outside. For a long time, he said nothing. He just watched her, his unreadable gaze resting on her face. Francis clutched the lapels of his coat, the fine wool a tangible link to the madness of the past hour. You should not have done that," she said, her voice a low murmur in the darkness. Done what?" he asked, his own voice devoid of inflection. "Offered a lady my coat." It seemed the gentlemanly thing to do. It was not gentlemanly. It was a declaration, she retorted, a spark of her usual fire returning. You made a spectacle of me, and of yourself. My aunt made a spectacle of you, he corrected, his tone hardening. I merely changed the ending of her play. So, he had seen it. He had seen the nudge, the deliberate stumble, the malice of forethought. He was not just observant, he was astute. The realization was unsettling, an ending that has left me in a more precarious position than before, as she pointed out. Before I was a dismissed schoolmistress. Now I am the subject of gossip from here to London. A woman of no family and no fortune, who has somehow ensnared a duke. Are you so easily ensnared, Miss Hadley? The question was quiet, but it held a genuine curiosity. I am a woman who has just lost her position and has enough savings to last a month, perhaps two, she answered, her honesty a stark, cold thing in the plush darkness. I am not in a position to be ensnared, Your Grace. I am in a position to be destroyed. He fell silent again, and she watched the play of light and shadow across his face. He looked older than his years, the weight of his title and his family pressing down on him. She saw not a duke, but the orphaned boy, alone, and fighting a battle on all fronts. There is a deadline, he said, abruptly changing the subject. The trustees of my parents' estate. They meet in 1 month. My aunt has been poisoning them against me for years. She claims I am an unfit guardian, that my grief has made me neglectful, that the children are wild and unhappy. Are they? Francis asked softly. He flinched, the first genuine crack in his composure. Yes, he admitted. The word raw. Eleanor is a fury of silks and sharp words. Julian is a ghost with fists. And Cecily builds walls of silence and hides behind them. Her governess quit this morning, the 5th one in 2 years. They say she sang her mother to death. Francia's breath caught a stupid, cruel thing. My aunt's words, of course, whispered where Cecily could overhear them after my mother's final illness. My mother loved to hear Cecily sing. But she had a fever, her lungs were weak. After she passed, Beatrice told the child her constant singing had tired her mother, had stolen her breath, so Cecily stopped. First the singing, then the speaking. She believes her own voice is a poison, a specific, particular cruelty. A wound so precise it could only have been crafted by a master of the art. The schoolmistress in Francis, the part of her that mended broken things, rose up in a wave of cold fury. That is monstrous, she whispered. It is effective. He countered grimly. It is the centerpiece of her petition for custody. A mute child, an angry heir, a resentful girl. She will argue that she can provide the stability. I cannot. She will win. And she will take my family from me. Now Francis understood the desperation she had seen in his eyes. This was not about a stained dress, it was about everything. The carriage rolled to a stop before a modest boarding house, the only one that would take a single lady of gentle birth, but no references. This is why you need a wife, she stated, the pieces falling into place with dreadful clarity, a respectable stable duchess. To present a united front. To show the trustees you are building a family, not letting one fall apart. He did not deny it. The trustees have made it a condition of my continued guardianship. Mary and Mary, well, by the time they meet, then you must find a lady of impeccable breeding and fortune, Frances said, her voice flat, Lady Anne, or a Miss Catherine. Someone whose name alone is a fortress, She began to shrug off his coat. The warmth of it suddenly, a lie. No, he said, his voice stopping her. A lady of impeccable breeding would be terrified of my siblings. A lady of fortune would see them as an inconvenience. They would try to change them, to mold them, to erase the memory of their mother, and start anew. They would fail, and the house would be colder than ever. He leaned forward, his gray eyes penning her in the dim light. I do not need a fortress. I need a teacher. Someone with moral courage. Someone who understands that grief is not stubbornness. Someone who sees a terrified child and does not look away. The air in the carriage grew thick. The unspoken thing lay between them, a proposition more shocking than the coat, more binding than any public scandal. You are mad!" she whispered. "I am desperate," he corrected. The world thinks I rescued you tonight, Miss Hadley. The truth is, I am asking you to rescue me, a title-worthy line. Indeed, I am asking you to rescue me." Frances stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was a transaction born of desperation, a bargain struck in the dark. He was offering her a title, a home, security beyond her wildest dreams. In return, he was asking for her life. He was asking her to walk into a house of sorrows, and somehow, impossibly, make it bloom. But it was the image of little Cecily, believing her own voice to be poison, that tipped the scale. Frances had failed one student, Eliza, by teaching her to be silent. She would not fail another. She would not be a duchess. She would be a teacher. And this would be the lesson of a lifetime. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. "The time for being a pawn was over, eh?" "Before I answer," she said, her voice gaining a strength she did not know she possessed, "you will agree to my terms." For the second time that night, he had come expecting to make a proposition. He had not expected to be met with a negotiation. He leaned back against the squabs, the faint light from a street lamp illuminating the sharp planes of his face. He looked less like a duke and more like a general considering a treaty. "You have terms." "Of course, I have terms," Frances said, a trace of her schoolmistress's crispness entering her tone. The absurdity of the situation, a penniless teacher dictating conditions to a duke in the middle of the night, was not lost on her, but the memory of Eliza's faded eyes gave her courage. "I will not enter your house as a piece of decorative furniture, Your Grace. I will not be a duchess in name only, to be paraded before trustees and then ignored." She took a breath, marshalling her thoughts. This was the most important examination she would ever set a first. She began, holding up one finger as she would to a student. "A will have complete authority over the nursery and the schoolroom. No interference. Not from you, not from your staff, and most certainly not from your aunt." He nodded, his eyes watchful. "Agreed." A second, she continued, her voice gaining strength. "We will not lie to the children. We will not pretend I am their mother. I am not. Their mother was the Duchess of Allister, and she will be honored in this house. Her portrait will remain. Her favorite songs will be songa when Cecily is ready. We will not build a new life by burying the old one." 18. At this, something profound shifted in his expression. The cool assessment in his eyes warmed, replaced by a dawning respect. He had expected her to demand jewels, allowances, status. She was demanding the right to honor his dead wife and care for his grieving siblings. Her name was Charlotte. He said the name, a quiet testament in the small space. She loved yellow roses. Then we shall plant yellow roses," Frances said simply, "which brings me to my third condition. You will tell me the truth. All of it, about the estate, about your aunt, about the children. I do not bargain with half a story. I will be your partner in this." "Not your puppet, a partner," he repeated, testing the word. It sounded foreign on his tongue. Dukes did not have partners. They had wives, subjects, dependents. "A partner," she affirmed. "A will manage the children and the household. You will manage the estate and the legal battle against your aunt. We will consult. We will be a united front, not just in public, but in private. You need this marriage to work, Your Grace. I am telling you how to make it possible." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. She had laid her cards on the table. There was no artifice, no coquetry, only the stark, clear lines of her character. She was offering him, not her heart, but her competence, not her affection, but her integrity. It was, he was beginning to realize, a far more valuable commodity. Men are slow, child, and dukes are slowest of all. and grief makes fools of the cleverest of us. For years, Crispin had been fighting a war of attrition. Alone, he had been trying to hold a crumbling fortress by himself. And now, a woman in a ruined gray dress was offering him not just a truce, but a blueprint for rebuilding. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the dismissed schoolmistress. He saw the woman who had faced down a room full of scorn with her chin held high. He saw the teacher who understood that a childish silence was a wound, not a fault. He saw the strategist who in 10 minutes had laid out a more coherent plan for his family's survival than he or his host of expensive lawyers had managed in 2 years. There is a fourth condition, he said, his voice low. Frances braced herself. And that is, you will call me Crispin. The use of his given name was as intimate as a touch. It was his surrender. It was his acceptance. It was the sealing of the strangest, most sensible bargain ever struck. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Very well, Crispin. He reached across the carriage and took her hand. His grasp was firm, his skin warm. It was not the hand of a lover, but of an ally. A co-conspirator. And I shall call you Frances, my lady, he added, after a beat, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time. The trustees will insist on it. The smile vanished as quickly as it appeared, but Frances had seen it. A small sign of life in the frozen landscape. One more thing, as she said, pulling her hand gently from his. She had his coat, his name, his alliance. But she needed one thing more. The maid at the school, the one falsely accused. Her name is Sarah. She has a younger sister to support. When this is done, I want you to find her a position in your household. A good one. He stared at her. Of all the things she could have asked for, a settlement, a guarantee she had asked for a place for a servant girl she barely knew. He had offered her a duchy, and she had countered with a request for a single small act of justice. In that moment, Duke Crispin of Allister understood that he had not found a solution to his problems. He had found something far more dangerous and far more valuable. He had found someone worthy. It is already done, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. A welcome to my family, Frances. He did not say a my Hosa or a my Lifa. He said a my famlia. And Frances, the dismissed schoolmistress, the woman of no fortune and no connections, felt the weight of those 3 words settle over her, heavier and more binding than any ducal coronet. She had made her bargain. Now she had to live with it, and with the 3 grieving children and the cold, magnificent house that were to be her life's. Next, most difficult lesson, entering Blackwood Manor was like stepping into a captured breath. The great hall was a cavern of shadows and silence, the air cold and still, tasting of dust and disuse. A vast, magnificent portrait of a beautiful, laughing Mamma Charlotte, Duchess of Alistera, dominated the grand staircase, but her painted joy only seemed to amplify the gloom. It was a house that had been holding its breath for 2 years, waiting for a life that was never coming back. The staff lined up to meet her. A silent, skeptical jury. The butler, Mr. Hemmings, was a pillar of starched disapproval. The housekeeper, Mrs. Croft, had a face that looked like it had been carved from a sour apple. They had seen 5 governesses come and go. They expected her to be the 6th. Frances was not a governess, she was their new duchess. But in their eyes, the distinction was meaningless. She was another outsider, another temporary fixture. And then there were the children. They were assembled in the drawing room, a room so cold, the hearth might as well have been a block of ice. Eleanor, the eldest, stood by the window, her back to the room, a rigid column of resentment. Julian, the boy, was slouched in a chair, whittling a piece of wood with a small, sharp knife, scattering shavings on the priceless Aubusson carpet with deliberate insolence. And Cecily, little Cecily, was a small, pale shape, half hidden behind a large potted fern, clutching a worn velvet ribbon, scrap of sunshine yellow. Crispin stood beside Francis, a tense, unhappy host in his own home. Eleanor, Julian, Cecily, he said, his voice too loud in the stillness. This is Miss Hadley. She has come to stay with us. He had failed at the first hurdle. Miss Hadley, she has come to stay. He had introduced her as a guest, a temporary measure, not as his betrothed, not as their future. He had lost his nerve. A poor gentlewoman with opinions is a luxury no household can afford. The words echoed in Francis's mind. But a duchess with opinions was a necessity this one could not survive without. She stepped forward, leaving Crispina's side. She ignored Eleanor's back and Juliana's knife. She walked directly to the potted fern and knelt, bringing herself down to the little Krala's level. She did not reach for her. She did not speak to her. She simply looked at the ribbon in Cecilia's hand. That is a lovely color," Francis said softly, her voice pitched for Cecily alone. Reminds me of the first daffodils in spring." Cecilia's grip on the ribbon tightened, but she did not pull away. Her large, dark eyes, so like her brother's, stared at Francis from the shadows of the fern fronds. "I had a ribbon just like it once," Francis continued, her voice a low, confidential murmur. "I kept it in a book of poems." From the chair, a snort of derision. "She does not talk," Julian said, his voice cracking with adolescent scorn. "She's stupid." Julian Crispina's voice was sharp as a whip. No," Francis said, without turning. "She's not stupid. She's quiet. There is a difference. A person who is quiet has more time to listen. I expect she is the best listener in this whole house." She rose, turning to face the boy. He glared at her, his knife pausing mid-slice. She looked at the shavings on the carpet, then back at his face. She did not scold. She did not reprimand. "That is a fine piece of wood," she observed. Oak." He shrugged, non-committal, but intrigued despite himself. "A linden. A softer wood. Good for carving details." "What are you making?" He held it up reluctantly. It was the rough shape of a bird, a hawk or a falcon. It was surprisingly good. "A nothing." It doesn't look like nothing?" Francis said. It looks like a beginning." She then turned her attention to the rigid figure at the window. A Lady Eleanor. Eleanor turned slowly, her expression one of pure, unadulterated contempt. It is Duchess, or will be," she said, her voice dripping ice. "You should learn to use the correct forms of address if you intend to play at being one of us." "I have no intention of playing at anything," Francis replied, her voice calm and even. "And I will call you Eleanor, just as I will expect you to call me Francis. We are to be a family, and families do not stand on ceremony." We are not a family," Eleanor spat. We were a family. You're a replacement. A bargain my brother made to keep his keepers off his back." The truth of it, so baldly stated, hung in the air. Francis saw Crispin flinch. This was her first test. She could be wounded, she could retreat, or she could teach. She walked towards Eleanor, stopping a few feet away. No one can replace a mother who was loved," she said, her voice softening. She glanced up at the portrait on the stairs. Your mother was beautiful. And from the look in her eyes, she was clever and full of life. I will not try to fill her shoes. They would not fit. But this house has been cold for a long time, Eleanor. The fires are not lit. The curtains are drawn. My role, as I see it, is not to replace the sun that was lost, but simply to open the curtains, to let in what light we can find. Eleanor stared at her, her lip trembling for a single unguarded moment. She had expected a fight, a battle for dominance. She had not expected this quiet, unshakable honesty. She had no defense against it. With a choked sound, she turned and fled the room. Julian scrambled up, stuffing his knife and his piece of linden wood into his pocket, and bolted after his sister. The room was silent again. save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Only Cecily remained, a small statue behind her fern. Crispin let out a long, ragged breath. "Oh well," he said, the word heavy with failure. That went badly." "I, on the contrary," Francis said, turning to him. "I think it went exactly as it needed to." "They are not porcelain dolls, Crispin. They are wounded, grieving children. They need to be angry. They need to test the boundaries. It is the only way they will ever feel safe again." She looked at him, at the exhaustion and despair etched on his face. "You cannot fix this for them," she said softly. "You can only stand with them while they learn to fix it for themselves." "And so can I," she stayed. That became her watchword, her strategy, her entire philosophy for surviving Blackwood Manor. The servants were frosty. She learned their names and the names of their children, and made a point of thanking them for small services. The housekeeper was impossible. Frances spent an afternoon in the kitchens with her, not giving orders, but asking for her recipes, her knowledge, poring over the household accounts and finding, with Mrs. Croft's grudging help, 3 separate suppliers who had been overcharging the estate for years. She did not win the housekeeper's affection, but she earned her respect. That, Frances knew, was more valuable. With the children, she was a quiet, constant presence. She did not force herself upon them. She simply existed, calmly and predictably in their orbit. For Julian, she cleared a table in the dusty, disused conservatory, laid out a set of proper carving tools, Shade had Crispin order from London, and a stack of books on ornithology. She never mentioned the project. She just left the door unlocked. 2 days later, she found the table covered in fresh shavings, the bird taking on a more refined shape. For Eleanor, she did something more radical. She brought her the estate ledgers. "Ah, your brother is overwhelmed," she said, placing the heavy books on the girl's writing desk. "Ah, your aunt claims he is incompetent. The truth is, he has been doing the work of 3 men since he was 19. This estate belongs to your family. To you. I thought you might wish to understand it." Eleanor had stared at the books as if they were snakes. But the next day, Frances saw her in the library, a dictionary on one side and a book on agricultural yields on the other, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was not arranging flowers. She was learning to rule her kingdom. For Cecily, she was simply there. She would bring a book into the drawing room and read quietly, in a chair near the fern. She would open the heavy velvet curtains a little wider each day, letting the sun pool on the floor. One afternoon, she brought a small, portable slate and a piece of chalk. She sat and drew Petruacia, flower, a bird, a house, with a smiling Suna, then wiped them away. She drew the daffodil she had spoken of, its yellow head bright, even in chalky white. She did not look at Cecily, but she felt the childish eyes on her. The slate was a silent conversation, a story told in marks that could appear and disappear without a sound, a mark that need not last to be real. Crispin watched all of this from a distance. He was a ghost in his own home, haunting the corridors and doorways, observing this quiet, determined woman who was slowly, methodically turning his house of mourning back into a home. He found himself changing his own routines, appearing in the library when he knew she would be there, taking his tea in the drawing room instead of his study. Their conversations were brief, formal, mostly about the estate or the children. But underneath the surface, a current was building. He would find his gaze lingering on the way the firelight caught the simple twist of her hair, the way her brow furrowed when she was reading a difficult passage, the quiet grace of her hands as she mended a tear in one of Juliana's shirts. He had married her for a purpose, as a solution. But she was stubbornly, inconveniently, becoming a person he found himself wanting to know. One evening, a storm rolled in from the coast, rattling the window panes and sending drafts snaking through the long corridors. Frances was in the library, trying to make sense of a particularly tangled bit of accounting, when a flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. A small, terrified cry echoed from the floor above. Frances was on her feet instantly. She flew up the grand staircase, her heart pounding. The cry had come from the children's wing. She found Crispin there, already standing helplessly outside Cecilia's door. Chasse, terrified of storms, he said, his voice strained. Since us, ever since us. The carriage overturned in a thunderstorm, another crash of thunder, and another wail from inside the room. Frances did not hesitate. She opened the door and slipped inside. The room was dark, save for the flashes of lightning. Cecily was a small, trembling lump under the covers of her large canopy bed. Frances moved to the bed and sat on the edge. Cecily," she said softly. A terrified whimper was the only reply. It is only the sky making a fuss, little one," Frances said, her voice a low, soothing murmur. It sounds very grand and important, but it is mostly just noise." It was a simple tune, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her. A gentle, rocking melody. She didn't sing the words, just the quiet, steady tune, a small island of calm in the raging storm. After a moment, she felt a slight lessening of the tension in the small body under the covers. She kept humming, her voice weaving a thread of peace in the darkness. The thunder still crashed, the lightning still flashed, but inside the room, the world was shrinking to the space of a single, gentle song. Slowly, tentatively, a small hand crept out from under the covers and found hers. Francese's fingers closed around it. The hand was cold, but it was no longer trembling. She sat there for what felt like hours, humming in the dark, holding the small hand, until the storm passed, and the child's breathing evened out into the deep, steady rhythm of sleep. When she finally rose, stiff and weary, she saw Crispin standing in the doorway. He had been there the whole time, watching. His face was undone. The ducal mask was gone, and in its place was a raw, aching vulnerability. He looked at her, at the woman who had walked into the heart of his daughter's terror and met it not with force or reason, but with a simple, quiet song. How did you know to do that?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. My mother used to do the same for me," she said simply, exhaustion making her plain. Some lessons are too good to forget." She moved to step past him, but he blocked her way. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the corner of her sleeve. The gesture was hesitant, almost shy. Thank you," he said. The two words were freighted with more meaning than 1,000 flowery speeches. It was not gratitude for a service rendered. It was the acknowledgement of a shared watch, a recognition that she was no longer just an ally in his war, but a guardian of his heart's most precious treasures. She looked up at him, and in the dim light of the hallway, she saw not a duke, not a bargain, but a man. A lonely, grieving man who was just as lost as his children. And in his eyes, she saw her own reflection, and for the first time since walking into this cold, broken house, she felt the first terrifying flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope. The thaw had begun. But Frances knew enough about the seasons to know that after the thaw comes the flood, and the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was gathering under their own roof. The petition arrived on a Tuesday. It was delivered by a clerk from the local magistrate, a man with a nervous twitch and an apologetic manner. The document was thick, bound in ribbon, and felt as heavy as a gravestone. Crispin read it in his study. The door closed. Frances waited in the library, the silence of the house pressing in on her. When he finally emerged, his face was pale, his eyes hard as flint. He handed her the papers without a word. The legal language was dense and convoluted, but the intent was clear. Lady Beatrice had formally petitioned the Court of Chancery for the guardianship of the persons and fortunes of Lady Eleanor, Master Julian, and Miss Cecily Allister, minors. She cited Jucas continued and profound melancholia, his neglect of the children's moral and educational welfare, and his recent, highly unsuitable and scandalous alliance. That was her. She was the unsuitable and scandalous alliance. Attached were affidavits, one from the headmistress of Frances's former school, attesting to her insubordinate nature and dangerously modern opinions, a one from Mr. Kendis Finch, the trustee, describing her as a penniless adventuress. There were statements from former governesses, all chirated by Beatrice, painting a picture of unruly, unhappy children driven to despair by their brother's cold indifference. The centerpiece was a long, saccharine statement from Beatrice herself, detailing Cecilia's tragic silence and her deep, aunt-like concern for the children she was prepared to rescue. It was a masterpiece of malice, a carefully constructed fiction, built on a foundation of half-truths. The hearing is set for 1 month from today, Crispin said, his voice a dead monotone. He walked to the window and stared out at the manicured lawns. My solicitor believes she has a strong case. Your solicitor is a pessimist, Francis said, placing the papers firmly on the table. This is not a legal document. It is a story. A false one. We simply need to tell a better story. A true one, Aya. And what is the true story, Francis? He asked, turning his voice laced with a bitterness she had never heard before. That I hid from my own children in my grief. That I allowed my aunt to poison my sister's mind. That I was so lost, so utterly incompetent, that I had to purchase a wife to solve my problems. The true story, she said, walking towards him, is that a young man, barely more than a boy, was handed an impossible burden and has carried it, alone, for years. The true story is that he loves his family so much, he was willing to risk scandal and censure to protect them. The true story is that this house is no longer silent. That is the story we will tell the court. His anger seemed to drain away, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. She will call you to testify. Her lawyers will tear you apart. They will paint you as a harlot who trapped a duke. Let them try, Frances said, her chin high. I have been a schoolmistress, Crispin. I am not easily intimidated by bullies asking trick questions. Our courage was afire in the cold room. He felt the warmth of it, and was ashamed of his own despair. He had been fighting this war for so long, and he had forgotten what it felt like to have an ally on the battlefield. But Beatrice's attack was not just on paper. In the weeks that followed, the social siege began. Invitations to Blackwood Manor were politely declined. When Crispin and Frances attended Sunday service, they were met with averted eyes and whispered conversations. The county had chosen its side. Frances was an outcast, and by association, so was the Duke. The pressure began to wear on the children. Julian got into a fight with the blacksmith's son, returning home with a split lip and a furious defensive pride. Eleanor retreated into her books, her silence a different, more brittle kind than Cecilia's. It was Cecily who felt the siege most acutely. One afternoon, Frances found her in the garden. By the new bed of yellow roses they had planted together, the child was staring at the blooms, her small face crumpled in distress. Her velvet ribbon, her sunshine yellow talisman, was gone. They searched for hours. The entire household was turned out, from the butler to the youngest stable boy. They combed every inch of the gardens, the drawing room, the nursery. The ribbon was nowhere to be found. By evening, Cecily was inconsolable. She refused to eat, refused to sleep. She sat in a small, tight ball in her room, her face buried in her knees, her small body racked with silent sobs. Frances sat with her, her heart aching. The ribbon was more than a ribbon. It was a link to her mother. It was her last piece of portable sunshine in a gray world. It was Crispin who found the truth. Late that night, he confronted Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper. He had noticed her averting her eyes all day, her hands constantly twisting in her apron. Under his quiet, relentless questioning, she broke. Lady Beatrice had visited that morning, while he and Francis were out. She had found Cecily in the garden. She had spoken to her, and she had taken the ribbon. Dirty frayed old thing," she had apparently said. "Ah, we shall get you a new one, a blue one. Much prettier." She had taken the last tangible piece of Charlotte from her daughter and had tried to replace it with herself. When Crispin told Francis, his voice was shaking with a rage so profound it was almost silent. "I will kill her," he said. The words a low, dangerous growl. "No," Francis said, placing a hand on his arm. "You will not. You will do something far more effective. You will win." That night something shifted between them. The crisis had stripped away the last of their pretenses. They were no longer a duke and his contracted duchess. They were a man and a woman, united against a common enemy, fighting for the love of 3 children. Later, unable to sleep, Frances went down to the library. She found Crispin there, a glass of brandy untouched on the desk beside him. He was staring into the fire, his face etched with a pain that was almost unbearable to witness. "Ah, it is my fault," he said, without looking at her. "All of it. The day of the accident we had argued, my father and I, about my future, about the woman I was expected to marry. I said unforgivable things. I wished him gone, and then he finally looked at her, his eyes hollow. My mother was with him. I have spent every day since, trying to atone for a wish that came true." Here was the heart of his wound, the guilt he had carried, the grief that had frozen him. He had not just lost his parents. He believed he had caused their death. Frances walked to him and did something she had never done before. She reached out and took his hand. It was not your fault, Crispin," she said, her voice firm. It was a storm. It was an accident. Your wish did not fell the tree that blocked the road. Your anger did not cause the carriage to overturn. You were a boy, and boys say foolish, angry things. You are not a god, to cast down your own father with a word. You are just a man who has been carrying a burden far too heavy for any one person to bear." He stared at their joined hands, then looked up at her, his eyes full of a terrible dawning hope. "You believe that? I know it," she said, "just as I know that Cecilia's voice is not poison. Some truths are simple, even if they are hard to see." He held her gaze for a long moment, and in the space between them, the last wall of his grief crumbled. He did not cry. He did not break down. He simply let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of release. As if a weight he had carried for a decade had finally been lifted. "Frances," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. What would I do without you? You would manage." "Ah," she said softly. "Ah. But I am glad you do not have to." The threat was no longer a distant rumble of thunder. It was the storm, and it had broken directly over their heads. But for the first time, they were not facing it alone. They were facing it together. The day of the hearing dawned, gray and overcast. The sky, the color of old pewter, Blackwood Manor was unnaturally quiet, the usual morning sounds of the household muffled by a blanket of apprehension. Frances, dressed with care in the same gray dress she had worn to the assembly, now impeccably repaired. It was her armor, a reminder of where this had all begun and how far she had come. She met Crispin at the bottom of the grand staircase. He was dressed in the severe black of a man in mourning, or a man going into battle. His face was pale, but his eyes were clear and determined. He held out his arm to her, and she took it. They were a united front. The courtroom was a small, wood-paneled chamber in the county town, stuffy and crowded. Every notable family in the district was there, drawn by the scent of scandal. It was a public execution, and they were the main attraction. Lady Beatrice was already seated, dressed in demure lavender. A vision of concerned piety, she gave Frances a small, triumphant smile. The proceedings began. Beatrice's solicitor was a silver-tongued serpent, weaving a narrative of neglect and despair. He called the headmistress, who spoke of Frances's unfeminine willfulness. He called Mr. Finch, who painted her as a scheming opportunist. He called a former, disgruntled groom, who spoke of the Duca's black moods and long absences. With each witness, Frances felt another stone being placed on the wall they were building around her, around Crispin, around the children. Crispin's solicitor did his best to cross-examine, to poke holes in the testimony, but the damage was being done. The story Beatrice was telling was simple, compelling, and ugly. Then, Beatrice herself took the stand. She spoke in a soft, trembling voice of her love for her late brother and his wife. She spoke of her heartbreak over the children's suffering. She described finding Cecily, a little ghost, and her desperate desire to bring the child back into the light. She spoke of the yellow ribbon. "Oh, filthy scrap," she said, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I only wanted to give her something clean, something new." It was a masterful performance. Frances could feel the mood of the room shifting, the sympathy flowing toward the grieving aunt. Finally, Beatrice's solicitor turned his venomous gaze on Frances. The petitioner claims, Your Lordship, that the Duca's judgment has been fatally impaired. As evidence, we need look no further than the woman he intends to make his duchess. I call Miss Frances Hadley. A murmur went through the crowd. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Frances walked to the witness box, her back straight, her head held high. She could feel Crispin's eyes on her, a steady, anchoring weight on Miss Hadley. The solicitor began, smiling like a shark. Is it true that you were dismissed from your position at the Bletchley Academy? Yes, Frances said, her voice clear and calm. And, is it true that on the night of your dismissal, you attended a public assembly where you contrived to meet the Duke of Alastair? I attended the assembly at the invitation of Lady Beatrice, Frances corrected gently. I did not contrive to meet the Duke. He was introduced to me by his aunt. The solicitor's smile faltered for a second. An assembly at which your dress was ruined. A glass of wine was spilled on me. Yes. And the Duke, a man you had just met, made a great public show of removing his own coat and placing it upon your shoulders? The Duke performed an act of kindness to a lady in distress? Frances said. An act of kindness, the solicitor sneered. That resulted in a proposal of marriage just hours later? Tell me, Miss Hadley, what precisely did you say to the Duke in that carriage to secure such a swift and profitable transaction? The accusation hung in the air, ugly and explicit. He was calling her a whore. Frances met his gaze and did not flinch. I told him the truth, sir, as I am doing now. The truth, he scoffed. And what is that? The truth is that the Duke of Alastair loves his siblings more than his own life. The truth is that Lady Eleanor is not resentful. She is fiercely protective. The truth is that Master Julian is not wild. He is grieving. And the truth, she said, her voice dropping, silencing the whispers in the room, is that Miss Cecily is not mute. She is a child who was told that her own voice, the very thing her mother loved most, was a poison that stole her life. She is not silent out of stubbornness. She is silent out of a love so profound she would rather sacrifice her own voice than ever risk harming that memory again. She paused, letting the words sink in. Guilty of what, sir? Of seeing these children not as damaged goods, but as human beings, of believing that a house of mourning can become a home again? If that is the charge, then I am guilty. And I would be guilty of it every day for the rest of my life. A.D. The solicitor was speechless. She had taken his narrative and torn it to shreds with the simple, unassailable power of the truth. But the final decisive blow came from an unexpected quarter. The magistrate, a wizened old man with tired eyes, leaned forward. Lady Eleanor, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, your aunt has testified to her deep love for you. What say you to this? All eyes turned to Eleanor, who sat beside Crispin, her face pale. She stood up, her hands trembling. She looked at her aunt, at Frances, at her brother. My aunt, she began, her voice shaking but clear. A has sent me bonbons and fashion plates. She has told me I should smile more. She has never once asked me what I am reading. She turned her gaze to Francis. Francisa, Miss Hadley, gave me the estate ledgers. She said I should learn to rule. She said my mind was a tool, not an ornament. She has never once told me to smile. She took a deep breath. My mother is gone. But Francis is teaching us how to remember her. My aunt is teaching us to forget. It was a cannon blast in the quiet room. Lady Beatrice's face went white with fury. Then a small sound, a rustle of fabric. Little Cecily, who had been sitting quietly beside her governess, stood up. She walked, step by careful step, from her seat, across the open floor, directly to where Francis stood in the witness box. The entire room held its breath. Cecily stopped before her. She reached into the tiny pocket of her dress and pulled out something small, a piece of linden wood, carved into the perfect, detailed shape of a hawk, its wings outstretched as if in flight, a gift from Julian. She held it up to Francis. And then, in the dead silence of the courtroom, she spoke. Her voice was small, rusty from disuse, but perfectly clear. For you. She said, and then she laid her head against the gray wool of Francisa's skirt. It was over. A childish voice, a carved bird, a simple truth spoken aloud. Lady Beatrice's carefully constructed world of lies collapsed into dust. The magistrate cleared his throat, his own eyes suspiciously bright. I believe, he said, his voice booming in the stillness, that this court has its answer. Petition denied. Crispin stood, walked to Francis, and put his arm around her. He gathered Cecily into his other arm. Eleanor and Julian came and stood with them, a family whole and unbroken. They had won. The public reckoning was complete, and the woman the world had dismissed had become the undeniable heart of it all. That night, Blackwood Manor was a different place. The fires were lit, every single one, casting a warm, dancing glow over the old stone. The staff, their skepticism, washed away by the tide of the day's victory, moved with a new lightness. Mrs. Croft had even produced a bottle of the late Duca's finest brandy, but in the library, where Crispin and Francis found themselves by unspoken agreement, the mood was not one of triumph, but of quiet, profound relief. The battle was over. The world had been faced down. Now, only the two of them remained. Francis stood by the window, looking out into the moonlit garden. The slate she had brought from the schoolroom, her one tangible link to her old life, sat on a nearby table. It was wiped clean. Crispin came to stand beside her. He did not speak for a long time, simply sharing the silence. The air between them was charged, full of all the things that had been left unsaid in the rush of contracts and crises. You were magnificent today, he said at last, his voice low and rough with emotion. I only told the truth, she replied softly. Yes. He said. A formidable habit of doing that. He paused. Francisa. He stopped, struggling for words. The eloquent, powerful Duke of Allister, who had faced down trustees and courts, was at a loss. He, who had inherited a world of duty, had no language for the world of feeling. She had unlocked within him a "you don't have to say anything," as she said, turning to face him. It was a bargain. We both knew the terms. You needed a wife to save your family. I needed a home. The bargain has been fulfilled. No, he said, his voice sharp with a sudden pain. That is not what this is. Not anymore, He took a step closer, his gray eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen before. It began as a bargain, a desperate, selfish act on my part. I saw your strength, your courage, and I wanted to use it for my own ends. I saw you as a solution, a key to unlock the prison I had built for myself. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was not possessive, but reverent. But I was wrong, he whispered. You were never the key. Frances, you were the woman who taught me the door was never locked in the first place. You walked into a house of ghosts and you did not banish them. You gave them names. You gave them peace. You did not just save my children. You saved me. His raw, plain honesty was more devastating than any poetic declaration. This was the confession she had never expected, the one she had never dared to hope for. But her own wounds, her own history of being merely useful, ran deep. She had to be sure. Do not say it if it is only gratitude, she whispered, her voice trembling. I could not bear that. He shook his head, a small, sad smile touching his lips. A gratitude, he said. My dear Frances, I have been in your debt since the moment you looked me in the eye and refused to be small. But this, he said, his gaze dropping to her lips, this is not gratitude? And then he kissed her. It was not a practiced, polished kiss of a seasoned duke. It was a clumsy, honest, heartfelt kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been frozen for a decade and was only just now learning to feel the warmth of the sun. It was a kiss full of gratitude, yes, but also of respect, of awe, and of a deep and abiding love that had grown in the stony soil of their strange bargain. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. The joke was on me, he murmured against her hair. I offered you a title to make you worthy of my world. I never realized that I was the one who needed to become worthy of you. Tears, she hadn't known she was holding back, finally fell hot and cleansing. Oh, Crispin! She cried softly, a laugh catching in her throat. He had finally learned the right lesson. He took her face in his hands. Marry me, Frances Hadley, he said, his voice thick. Not because the trustees demand it, not because it is a sensible arrangement, but because this house is not a home without you. Because I am not whole without you. Yes, she whispered, the single word holding the weight of her entire heart. Yes. 6 months later, the Duchess of Allister stood on the terrace of Blackwood Manor, a cup of tea warming her hands. The late autumn sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across a garden that was no longer neglected. Yellow roses, the last of the season, still bloomed defiantly against the old stone wall. From the lawn below, the sound of laughter drifted up. Julian was teaching Cecily how to fly a kite, a magnificent creation in the shape of a hawk. Cecily was not just speaking now, she was shouting with glee, her voice carrying on the crisp air, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. On a nearby bench, Eleanor sat with a book, but she was not reading. She was watching her siblings, a small, genuine smile on her face. Crispin came to stand beside her, slipping an arm around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He was no longer a ghost in his own home. The lines of grief and strain had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. He was a man who had learned to live in the light. Mrs. Croft is threatening to make a fig-tier cake for Cecilia's birthday, he murmured in her ear. I believe she has finally adopted you, Frances laughed, leaning her head back against his shoulder. It only took me proving that I could balance a household budget and produce 3 happy children, a small price to pay for her approval, he teased. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the kite soar against the vast blue sky. Do you ever miss it? He asked quietly. The schoolroom? The chalk dust? Frances thought for a moment. She thought of the woman she had been. The woman who felt her mark on the world was as temporary as a drawing on a slate. Now her marks were everywhere, in the laughter of a child who had found her voice, in the confidence of a young woman who had found her purpose, in the warmth of the man who held her. These marks were not erasable. They were carved into the very heart of this family, this home. I kept the lesson, she said softly. That is all that matters. Later that evening, after the children were in bed, Frances went to Cecilia's room. She had done it every night for 6 months. She smoothed the covers and leaned down to kiss the child's forehead. Cecilia's eyes fluttered open. She smiled, a sleepy, contented smile. "A good night, Mama," she whispered, and snuggled back into her pillows. The words, so simple, so natural, settled into Francisa's heart, filling the last empty space. She had not replaced a mother. She had simply become one. She walked back down the grand staircase, her hand trailing on the smooth, cool banister. The portrait of Charlotte, the first Duchess, still hung in its place of honor, her painted eyes seeming to smile down with approval. Frances paused, looking up at the beautiful, laughing woman. She had not filled her shoes. She had found her own footing, right beside them. Crispin was waiting for her in the library, a book open in his lap, the firelight dancing on his face. He looked up as she entered, and the love in his eyes was a steady, constant flame. She had not been a replacement. She had not been a bargain discharged, in a house that had been falling apart, in a family that had been lost to grief. She had become the woman who stayed. She was home. What part of Frances's quiet strength resonated with you the most? We love reading your thoughts about where you are watching from and what these stories mean to you. Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey of the heart, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of love against the odds. We have a new story waiting for you, and we cannot wait to share it. Until next time, take care.